So now that we know what oligopoly is and how it is structured, we're going to look in this module at a theory that has been developed by social scientists and is used by economists, political scientists, and in other social sciences to describe competition in certain areas, sometimes between countries, and in this case, between rival firms when there are only a few of them in an industry. And that is called game theory. And it's just what it says. It's a theory that assumes that these firms are engaging in strategic behavior and actually playing a game with each other because they are mutually dependent on each other. So the actions of one firm affect the outcome for another firm and vice versa. And so they kind of have to guess at each other's behavior, and in a way they're playing this strategic game with each other. So this is the theory that we're going to look at and how it is played. So we're going to use game theory to enhance our understanding of oligopoly. We'll analyze something called the prisoner's dilemma using a payoff matrix to show what outcomes might look like under this situation. And then we'll determine what a dominant strategy is and what is called a Nash equilibrium in a variety of different games. So what is game theory? Well, as I said, game theory is used in a lot of different social sciences. It's used in economics to understand oligopoly behavior amongst firms, but it's also used when you study political science and you look at behavior of countries towards each other. Political scientists will use it to understand how countries interact with each other. So game theory is simply the study of how people behave in strategic situations when the actions of one determine the outcome for another and vice versa. So an understanding of game theory helps firms in an oligopoly maximize their profit. So it's like playing a game of chess with each other and trying to outdo your opponent. Now, when two firms are close rivals, the choices of each affect the outcomes for each. In other words, they are mutually interdependent. For example, if a retailer like Target lowers the price of a Nintendo Wii, it expects to steal customers from a store like Best Buy. And this will prompt Best Buy to match the lower price on the Wii and maybe even offer something else to entice customers away from Target. These strategies and mutually interdependent outcomes can be studied with game theory. Okay? Here is one simple definition of game theory. It's the study of how interdependent decision makers make choices, or when the decisions of two or more firms significantly affect each other's profits, they are in a situation of interdependence, and the study of their behavior in these situations of interdependence is known as game theory. So game theory helps us to predict human behavior. We could do a simulation of where the best place is to set up an ice cream stand on a beach. And so if you're an ice cream salesman at the beach and you are selling your ice cream for an identical price as another salesman, beachgoers will purchase from the closest salesman. And if people are evenly distributed along the beach, each morning the two firms have to pick locations where they are going to sell on the beach. Where would the best location be for you to set up on the beach? Where should you put your firm? Well, firm A decides where to go first. So what is the best strategy for choosing a location each day? Well, you want to be, if your price is identical to your competitor's price and people choose the location closest to them, then you want to be closest to the most people. So can you predict the end result each day? Well, the end result is that A and B would set up their stands right next to each other in the middle of the beach, because they would both be closest to the greatest number of people that way. So how is this observed in the real world? Well, often we see gas stations right across the street from each other on the same corner. Or you see Starbucks and other coffee shops located right near each other in the same location. Why? Well, because they feel like they can draw the maximum number of customers that way. So, why do we learn about game theory? Well, oligopolies are interdependent on each other, since they compete with only a few other firms. So the prices they set, their pricing strategy, and their output decisions must be strategic to avoid economic losses, meaning they can't just decide on their own what price and output they want to set. They have to also consider the behavior of their competitors and what their competitors might do, because that will affect their profit and output as well. So game theory helps us to analyze their strategies. Now, this is a video clip that you may wish to watch from The Dark Knight. It's on the ACDC Econ website, where Mr. Clifford goes in and he uses a scene from that movie, the Dark Knight, that shows game theory in action. So you may wish to pause the video now and move over to the ACDC Econ website and watch this. Now, what did we learn from all of that? Well, number one, we learned that oligopolies must use strategic pricing. In other words, they can't just set prices on their own. They have to worry about the prices that their competitor or the other guy will set and the behavior of the other guy, because that's going to affect them. So they have to try to figure that out when determining their own strategy. Secondly, we learned that oligopolies have a tendency to collude to gain profit. Okay? So what is collusion? Well, collusion is the act of cooperating with your rival in order to rig a situation. In other words, instead of guessing the strategy of your opponent, you get together with your competitor and you rig the system. And you work together to increase output, to set production levels, and raise prices to get closer to monopoly profits, rather than competing with each other and driving prices down and reducing your profits. Now, you can do this. The thing is that we saw collusion in that movie that Mr. Clifford showed us on The Dark Knight. We saw that collusion results in the incentive to cheat. So, yeah, maybe you agree with your opponent that you're going to restrict output and pricing, but as an individual firm, you look at it and you say, but if I cheat on my agreement, I can get more profit on my own. Overall industry profit will go down, but I'll get more of my profit than my competitor. So there's always the incentive to cheat. Yes, you can collude, but the incentive is always there to cheat. So we also learned that firms make informed decisions based on their dominant strategies. And we'll look more in this module at what a dominant strategy is and how they use it to inform their decision. Now, here's a tip for the AP exam. I have frequently seen questions about game theory on the AP exam, not only on the multiple choice section. This is a very common question for number 2 or 3 on the free response question. I have many times, every 2 or 3 years, seen a payoff matrix as question 2 or 3 on the free response section. So it's something that you absolutely have to know, understand, and be able to do to succeed on the AP exam. As I said, you'll most likely see it on multiple choice, but you very likely may see it on the FRQ as well. So game theory questions show up frequently on the AP exam, and to improve your performance on these questions, you have to learn several things. First of all, you have to know how to determine the dominant strategy and to find it and read it from a payoff matrix. You also have to know how to determine a Nash equilibrium and to find it in a payoff matrix. And you have to learn how to determine the payoff for each firm. So let's look at how we do this, if these are so important to know. So the reward received by a player in a game, such as the profit that's earned by an oligopolist, that is their reward, profit. That's what we call the player's payoff. And we examine it in what we call a payoff matrix. And a payoff matrix shows how the payoff or reward to each of the participants in a two-player game depends on the actions of both of them. So such a payoff matrix helps us to analyze the interdependence between the two firms and why and how they depend on each other to maximize their payoff or reward. We use something called the prisoner's dilemma. Now, the prisoner's dilemma is an example of a non-cooperative game where each player competes to maximize individual payoffs and ignores the effects of his or her action on the payoffs received by the rival. So oftentimes, we could look at it this way. And police will sometimes use this to get confessions out of prisoners. So let's assume that two people have been charged with a crime. And they're dragged into the police station and they're put in separate rooms, and the police are trying to get each one to confess. So each prisoner has one of two choices when they're interviewed by the police. Now remember, each person is in a separate room being interviewed by the police separately. They can't text each other. They can't communicate with each other. They don't know what the other person is going to say or do. And so in that situation, each prisoner has one of two choices when the police come in and question them. They can deny their participation in the crime, or they can confess their participation in the crime. And so we can set up a payoff matrix based on those particular choices. So here in the left-hand column, we see prisoner 1 has two choices, can deny or confess. Prisoner 2 has one of two choices, deny or confess. And so we measure prisoner 1's potential outcomes across a row, and we measure prisoner 2's potential outcomes based on a column. Now, if you look at this, prisoner 1 is going to be in there and say, well, do I deny or do I confess? So prisoner 1 will ask this question. They will say, well, what happens if prisoner 2, the person in the other room, denies it? Well, if I deny, I get 5 years in jail. If I confess, I go free. So what's a better outcome? Going free. So in that situation, it would be better for prisoner 1 to confess if prisoner 2 denies it. But prisoner 2 could also confess. So what if prisoner 2 confesses? Well, if prisoner 1 denies, they get 20 years in prison. But if they confess, they get 10 years. Well, 10 years is less than 20. So 10 is a better outcome. So if prisoner 1 denies, confessing for prisoner 1 is a better outcome. If prisoner 2 confesses, confessing for prisoner 1 is a better outcome. In other words, regardless of whether prisoner 2 denies or confesses, for prisoner 1, confessing is a better outcome. However, notice that the best outcome for both of them would be for them to both deny, because if they both deny, they get the minimum amount of time in jail, 5 years each. But they don't know what the other one is doing. Now let's look at prisoner 2. Prisoner 2 might say, well, what if prisoner 1 denies? Well, prisoner 2 says, well, if I deny, or if prisoner 2 denies, I get 5 years if I deny, I get 20 years if I confess. So 5 years is better. But what if prisoner 1 confesses? Well, if I confess, I go free if I deny, and I get 10 years if I confess. So in both cases, denying would be a better outcome, or confessing would be a better outcome. So prisoner 2 looks at this situation and they say, okay, if prisoner 1 denies 5 or 20, 5 is a better outcome. If prisoner 2 confesses to the crime, and then you look at that, then I could get 20 or 10. And so you look at those situations and you say, okay, well, what's the better outcome? And so in that outcome, confessing is better. So in this situation, both prisoner 2 and prisoner 1 are going to confess and get 10 years in jail. But notice, if they had cooperated with each other, they would have benefited both by denying and only getting 5 years. And so this is what we are going to call a dominant strategy. Let's look at another example from the Super Bowl. Let's say two firms, GM and Ford, can advertise new models during the Super Bowl. If one firm advertises and the other does not, the firm that advertises will sell many more cars. If both advertise, both will sell more cars, and if neither advertises, both will sell just a few more cars. This payoff matrix shows how much additional revenue in millions of dollars each firm will earn as the result of the Super Bowl decision. But the payoffs are dependent upon what the rival firm chooses to do. Now, suppose we are Ford. Assuming that GM advertises, okay, we should advertise because we would earn $100 rather than $50 if we did not advertise. Okay. Assume that GM is choosing to not advertise. Well, then we should choose A because we would earn $150 rather than $50 if we choose not to advertise. So no matter what GM chooses, Ford is always better choosing to advertise rather than to not advertise. When that is true, when one strategy for a firm is always better, regardless of what the other firm does, that is called a dominant strategy. Now, a dominant strategy doesn't have to exist. A firm does not always have a dominant strategy. Many times there is not one. And sometimes when you get these payoff matrices on the AP exam, they ask you what the dominant strategy for each firm is. And sometimes neither of them have one. Sometimes only one has one. Sometimes they both have one. So that's why it's important to be able to read a payoff matrix and determine if a firm has a dominant strategy or not. And if they do, what it is. So a dominant strategy is a strategy that outperforms any other strategy, no matter what strategy an opponent selects. Now, suppose we are General Motors. Let's look at it from General Motors' point of view. Assuming that Ford advertises, we should advertise because we would earn $100 rather than $50 if we did not advertise. Assuming that Ford is choosing not to advertise, we should choose to advertise because we would earn $150 rather than $50 if we choose not to advertise. So no matter what Ford chooses, General Motors is always better choosing to advertise rather than not advertise. So that also represents a dominant strategy for General Motors. So in this case, both firms have a dominant strategy, and that dominant strategy is to advertise during the Super Bowl. So because of that, both firms will make that choice, and both will earn $100 and the game ends. Now, when this happens, this is referred to as a Nash equilibrium outcome. So that's the second thing you need to know, what a Nash equilibrium is. Let's look at this next example of a game theory matrix. Let's say you and your partner are competing firms and you have one of two choices. You can price high or you can price low. Now, what would you choose to do in this situation? Well, if you're firm 1, you look at this and you say, okay, I'm firm 1. So what if firm 2 charges a high price? Well, if I charge a high price, I get $20. If I charge a low price, I get $30. So low is better. And if firm 2 charges a low price, if I charge a high price, I get 0, but if I charge a low price, I get 10. So in both cases, charging a low price is better for firm 1, regardless of whether firm 2 charges a high or a low price. So charging a low price is a dominant strategy for firm 1. Now firm 2 looks at firm 1 and says, well, what if firm 1 charges a high price? Well, firm 2 says, if I charge high, I get $20. If I charge low, I get $30. So low is better. What if firm 1 charges a low price? If I charge a high price, I get 0. And if I charge a low price, I get 10. Well, 10 is better than 0. 30 is better than 20. So low price is also a dominant strategy for firm 2. So as a result of that, both of them will charge a low price, and that will be a dominant strategy for both firms. Now, Notice that you have an incentive to collude, but also an incentive to cheat on your agreement. Because if you cheat on your agreement, you can actually earn more profit than if you collude. Why is that? Well, because if you collude, if both firms collude and charge a high price, they both get $20. Okay? But firm 2 says, but if I lower my price, instead of getting 20, I can now get 30. And firm 1, if you collude and get $20, firm 1 says, oh, but if I lower my price, I can get 30 instead of 20. And so both firms have an incentive to cheat. So even if they collude and agree to keep prices high and each split $20, each has an incentive to cheat and charge a low price to try to get $30. But notice what happens. If they both do that and cheat, and they both charge a low price, they both only get $10, not $30. And that's less than they would have gotten if they colluded. So the incentive to cheat takes that away and may drive the price back down closer to marginal cost. So the dominant strategy is the best move to make regardless of what your opponent does. Okay? So what is each firm's dominant strategy? Well, firm number 1 in this case, the dominant strategy is to charge a high price, since they should always go high. Because if firm 1 charges a high price, firm 1 says, oh, 100 is better than 50. If they charge a low price, 60 is better than 20. So you can circle that in the matrix. And one strategy for doing this is that the firm that is on the horizontal axis here, the firm 1 on the left side, their payoffs will always be listed first in each box. And the firm that is on top, which in this case is firm 2, their payoffs will always be listed on the right-hand side of the payoff matrix. So it helps when you do this if you circle the outcome for each firm, regardless of it. Now, for firm 1, if there are 2 circles in the same row, they have a dominant strategy. For firm 2, if there are 2 circles in the same column, they have a dominant strategy. But notice with firm 2, they don't. Firm 1 has a dominant strategy because they have 2 circles in the same row. High, high and low, regardless of what firm does. So if firm 1 charges a high price, charging a high price is better. If firm 2 charges a low price, charging a high price is better. So charging a high price is always better for firm 1. And 2 circles in the same row, they have a dominant strategy. But look at firm 2. If firm 1 charges a high price, firm 1 says, oh, I can get 50 or 90. 90 is better, so a low price is better. But if firm 1 charges a low price, I can get 40 or 10. Oh, charging a high price is better. So in one case, a low price is better. In the other case, a high price is better. So they don't have 2 circles in the same column. So firm 2 does not have a dominant strategy. Now, what is a Nash equilibrium? Okay, a Nash equilibrium is when the game ends and each player is happy with the outcome given the choice made by the rival. In the case we looked at with GM and Ford, both players had dominant strategies. It didn't matter what the rival car company was doing. It was always the right choice to advertise. So at the end of the game, both firms are happy with this mutually dependent outcome. So when that happens, there's a Nash equilibrium. Now, is there an outcome other than both choosing to advertise that both Ford and GM could agree is better for both firms? No. So because of that, this game is not a prisoner's dilemma. Remember, the traditional prisoner's dilemma would involve 2 crooks who have been caught by the police. So with this Nash equilibrium, the outcome that will occur when both firms make decisions simultaneously and have all the information. So in this case, firm 1 is high, firm 2 being low. That's the Nash equilibrium. Well, how do we know that? Well, we look at this and we say, okay, regardless of what the rival does, okay, if this is, both firms say, I make my decision, regardless of what my rival does. This is the right outcome. There's a Nash equilibrium. So since firm 1 will always go high in that particular case, firm 2 will decide to go low. And because of that, there's a Nash equilibrium. Now, let's look at this payoff matrix here. Okay, let's say that this is a company producing lysine, and they can choose to produce 30 million pounds or 40 million pounds. Firm 1 looks at this and says, okay, if firm 2 produces 30 million pounds, I can make 180 million in profit or 200 million. 200 million is better, so producing 40 million pounds is better. But what if firm 2 produces 40 million pounds? I can make 150 or 160. Again, producing 40 million pounds is better. So for firm 1, producing 40 million pounds is a dominant strategy. What about firm 2? Well, if firm 1 produces 30 million pounds, firm 2 says, well, if they produce 30 million pounds, I can make 180 or 200. No, 200 is better. Well, what if firm 1 produces 40 million? I can make 150 or 160. Producing 40 million pounds is better. So producing 40 million pounds is better for firm 1 and for firm 2. So producing 40 million pounds is a dominant strategy for both of them. But notice, they both would have been better off if they had colluded and produced 30 million pounds and made 180 million profit each. But because they both have an incentive to cheat, if they do that and both produce 40 million pounds because it's a dominant strategy, now each of them only takes home 160 million in profit rather than 180 million they would have made if they both colluded and kept production at 30 million pounds. So it's very important on the AP exam for you to learn how to interpret a payoff matrix. You have to know how to read one. And in the previous example, the matrix was color-coded. On the AP exam, these matrices won't be color-coded. So as I said, the firm that is on the right, well, its payoff numbers will always be listed on the right-hand side of each box. And the firm that is on top, its payoff numbers will always be listed as the second numbers in each box. And so you have to learn how to be able to read those. Now, economists use game theory to study firms' behavior when there is interdependence between their payoffs. And the game, as we've seen, can be represented with this payoff matrix. And depending on the payoffs, now this is important to remember, a player may or may not have a dominant strategy, and you have to be able to interpret that on the payoff matrix. Sometimes both have a dominant strategy, sometimes only one has a dominant strategy, and sometimes neither of them has a dominant strategy. Now, when each firm has an incentive to cheat, but both are worse off if both cheat, that's called a prisoner's dilemma. So if they both have a dominant strategy to cheat, that's when you have a prisoner's dilemma. Because cheating makes them both worse off if they both do it. If only one of them cheated, they would be better off than if they worked together. But if they both have the incentive to cheat and they both do it, they're both worse off because it's a dominant strategy for both of them than if they work together. And when that happens, it's called a prisoner's dilemma. So the game is played on two premises. Each player has an incentive to choose an action that benefits itself at the other player's expense. But when both players act in this way, both end up worse off than if they had acted cooperatively together. So, again, to review the prisoner's dilemma, involving two crooks who have been caught by the police on suspicion of a major crime like armed robbery of a jewelry store, if the cops can't prove that they robbed the store without a confession, they did find the crooks in possession of the stolen jewelry, so this minor crime can be proven without a confession. And if you've ever watched Law and Order, you know that the crooks will be separated and questioned, and each will be offered a deal if they confess. So this payoff matrix summarizes the strategies and outcomes for these crooks. And the payoffs are measured as years in prison. So unlike when we look at profit, having a higher number is always better. But if we're talking about years in prison, having a lower number is obviously better. So notice here, confession is the dominant strategy when the game is played simultaneously, and they cannot talk to each other and collude. No matter what crook number 2 does, it's always better for crook number 1 to confess. The same is true of crook number 2's thinking. And when that happens, it's a Nash equilibrium. So characteristic of the prisoner's dilemma is that players will pursue their dominant strategy, and the game comes to a Nash equilibrium and ends. However, the outcome in this case is an undesirable one, and they both end up with more years in prison than if they had colluded and worked together. And it could have been avoided through some kind of cooperative agreement called collusion. What would happen if they could talk for 5 minutes, write their decision down on a piece of paper, and hand it to the detective? Well, they would still have a dominant strategy to confess. You would need a strong deterrent to confession, and that might involve getting whacked. Here's another example of the prisoner's dilemma. I won't go through it and explain it to you, but you might want to pause the video and see if you can determine a dominant strategy and if there's a Nash equilibrium in this situation. Now here's a video on game theory, so I'm going to play it for you.
Hi, I'm William Spaniel. Let's learn some game theory. Today we're going to talk about the oldest game in all of game theory, the prisoner's dilemma, and something called the strict dominance solution concept. Now, this is the very first thing I talk about in my textbook, Game Theory 101, The Basics. You can find a little bit more information about that in the description to this video, and you can find the book itself on Amazon. It's only $1. I highly suggest you check it out. That aside, let's get to this game and actually solve it. So the situation is something like this. 2 suspects are arrested outside of a store. The police think that they were trying to rob the store, but they really only have enough evidence to prove that the suspects were trespassing. Thus, the police are going to need one of the criminals to rat the other one out in order to charge them for the greater crime of attempted robbery. And to get someone to confess, they're going to offer the suspects a deal simultaneously while they are sequestered in interrogation rooms. And the deal looks like this. If no one confesses to the robbery, the police can only really charge the prisoners with trespassing, and the punishment for that is 1 month in jail apiece. If one confesses and the other one does not, then the police will be lenient on the rat, essentially being thankful for his confession, and severely punish the one who remained quiet. And in this case, it's 12 months in jail for the one who kept quiet, and 0 months in jail for the rat. So the one who confesses just basically gets to walk away. And finally, and this is also the rub, if both confess, then the police can punish both of them equally for attempted robbery, and that's going to be worse than just trespassing. So the punishment here is 8 months in jail apiece. The question that we're interested in is as follows. Suppose the thieves only want to minimize the number of months they spend in jail. Should the suspects confess to the police? And the way we're going to try to solve this is by taking all of that information, which was a lot. I mean, if we look at this, there's a lot of text between all of these slides. And we want to condense all that information into something a little bit more manageable. And fortunately, game theory allows us to do this in a very nice way through something called strategic form, which is essentially a matrix that looks like this. Now, this has all of the information that I just said in all of the past few slides. So we have 2 players. We have player 1, player 2. Player 1's in blue, player 2 is in red. Each of those players has 2 strategies. They can either keep quiet and not say anything to the police, or they can confess their crime to the police. And based off of what the players do, they end up at particular outcomes, which have particular payoffs associated with them. So if player 1 were to keep quiet, which gets us this row right here, and player 2 were to confess, which is this column right here, then they end up at this outcome right here, where player 1 spends 12 months in jail, so he gets minus 12 as his payoff, and player 2 gets no time in jail, so she gets 0 months in jail. And you'll notice I just referred to player 2 as a woman there, as she. And the reason that I did that is because this is a very common norm to use in game theory. Whenever we're talking about player 1, he's a man, and whenever we're talking about player 2, she's a woman. The reason for that is precisely because of these pronouns. It allows us to use he, she, him, and her, which makes things a lot easier and a lot less annoying than me spending 10 minutes on a video constantly repeating player 1 and player 2. You would grow tired of that very quickly, trust me on it. So we're just going to always refer to player 1 as a man and player 2 as a woman. The colors here are going to be nice to keep track of that. Player 1 is blue, he's the man. Player 2 is red, she is the woman. And just as another convention here, and this seems reasonable here, is that player 1's payoffs always come first in these matrices, player 2's payoffs always come second. It's easy in these videos because I have everything color-coded. Might be a little bit more difficult in text, but something to keep in mind. Should be pretty straightforward, though. Don't worry about that too much. Now, if we're actually interested in solving this game, the strategic form really comes in handy because it allows us to organize our thoughts very clearly. And the way we're going to solve this is by putting ourselves in the player's shoes. So imagine for a second that we're player 1 and we knew that player 2 is going to keep quiet. Let's think about what we should do optimally as player 1. So our payoffs here are blue. We've just blocked out player 2's payoffs because they don't really matter here. We're just thinking about what is best for us as player 1. And we see that if player 2 is going to keep quiet, if we confess, then we spend no time in jail, 0 months. And if we keep quiet, then we spend 1 month in jail, so we get a -1 here. Now this 0 is greater than this -1, so confessing is better than keeping quiet, which means that if player 2 were to keep quiet, then we as player 1 would want to confess. Okay, so we know that piece of information. Let's switch to the other way. Let's say player 2 was going to confess, and we knew that for sure as player 1. What should we do? Well, if we keep quiet, we spend 12 months in prison, that's a -12. If we confess, we spend 8 months in jail, that's -8. -8 is greater than -12, so that means if player 2 were to confess, we should confess as well and get here. But you'll notice there's something interesting there. Regardless of what player 2 chooses, it's better for us as player 1 to confess. And so, what should we do? Well, we as player 1 should confess. And the reason for that is because of this strict dominance idea. So, confess strictly dominates keep quiet for player 1 because confess gives player 1 a better payoff than keep quiet, regardless of what player 2 does. Essentially, no matter what player 2 does, player 1 is always happier by confessing. And this shouldn't come as too much of a surprise given what we've just done. If we were to put ourselves in player 2's shoes, we would see the exact same thing, that confess will strictly dominate keep quiet for her as well. Let's just run through this really quickly to confirm that. So suppose we are player 2 and we know that player 1 is going to keep quiet, so we're blocking out his payoffs, that's why they're black, and we're only focusing on player 2's red payoffs here. So player 1 is going to keep quiet. If player 2 confesses, then she earns 0. If she keeps quiet, she earns -1. Confessing is better than keeping quiet, so she would want to confess in that situation. And she would also want to confess if player 1 was going to confess, because this -8 is better than this -12. So again, regardless of what player 1 does, player 2 is always better off by confessing. And so we took this whole game right here, and we've actually already found the solution. We know that both players are going to confess, and they'll reach this outcome right here. Now, new people to game theory get a little bit confused here. They'll look at the keep quiet outcome, where both players keep quiet, and think to themselves, well, why can't we just get to this outcome? It's better for both players in this outcome. And they're right. It's actually better. Both guys here spend 1 month in jail, and that's better for both of them than spending 8 months in jail apiece. The problem is that this is an inherently unstable outcome. If we were to, say, maybe agree to playing these strategies before the prisoner or before the police threw us in jail, we wouldn't actually want to follow through with those strategies once it was actually time to play. We know that if we were in this situation, we would be better off confessing in response to the other one keeping quiet, and so we would move to this outcome. But we know also that player 2 would want to confess in response to us confessing, and so we end up over here. So this outcome right here, this confess outcome, is stable, and that's why we really like it. It's got this sense of stability that the other outcomes don't have, and so that's why we refer to the confess outcome as the solution to this game. Now, strict dominance is a very important concept to understand in game theory, and so if you don't have it down in this video, that's okay. The next video, which you can access by clicking on this box right down here, We'll talk about strict dominance in another context in something called iterated elimination of strictly dominated strategies. That's up next. And if you want to click up in this box right here, this will subscribe to my channel so you get all of my latest videos and all of my most up-to-date information. You can click on the top left box to access that. In the meantime, I hope this video has been helpful, and I will see you next video. Thanks.
Okay, so there we saw again the action of a dominant strategy, and that exists when it is a player's best action regardless of the action taken by the other player. Now, as I said, depending on the payoffs, a player may or may not have a dominant strategy. It could, and it also could up in a Nash equilibrium. John Nash was an accountant that came up with this idea of game theory, and that's why it's called, when we talk about a Nash equilibrium, it was named after him. There was actually a book written about him called A Beautiful Mind, and it was actually made into a movie. So a Nash equilibrium is also known as a non-cooperative equilibrium. And a Nash equilibrium occurs when each player in a game chooses the action that maximizes his or her payoff given the actions of other players, ignoring the effects of his or her action on the payoffs received by those other players. Players who don't take their interdependence into account arrive at a Nash or non-cooperative equilibrium. But if a game is played repeatedly, players may engage in strategic behavior, sacrificing short-run profit to influence future behavior. So in repeated prisoner's dilemma games, what we sometimes come up with is something called tit for tat. And that's often a good strategy, tit for tat strategy, and it leads to successful tacit or unspoken collusion. Tit for tat involves playing cooperatively at first, then doing whatever the other player did in the previous period. When firms limit production and raise prices in a way that raises each other's profits, even though they have not made any formal agreement, they are engaged in tacit collusion. So let's revisit the example from the last module. Suppose there are only 2 gas stations in a small rural town of Boontucky. These gas stations, Margaret's Quickie Stop and Pam's Pump Station, are duopolists in the gasoline market, and they each sell 50% of all of the gas in town. At 8 a.m., each gas station posts one of 2 prices, a high price, PH, or a low price, PL. Once the price is posted, it cannot be changed until tomorrow. Customers only care about which station has the lowest price. So the low price station will drastically outsell the high price station. The dominant strategy for each firm is to price low. And this is a prisoner's dilemma. If they were able to cooperate and monitor each other, probably over time, they might be able to attain price-high profits. So Pam and Margaret, after days and days, months and months of this repeated prisoner's dilemma, wonder if there is a way they could cooperate and earn each $80 rather than $60 by playing the dominant strategy. They could meet at the local pancake house every morning and agree to set a cooperative PH price. But neither enjoys the prospect of prison, because if they do this, that's illegal behavior in the United States, and they can go to prison for that kind of collusion, so that is unlikely. But this meeting isn't the only form of collusion. Tacit collusion means unspoken collusion. Kind of like we don't talk about it, we don't say anything about it. It's kind of like a wink and a nod. It's like, I'm going to keep my price high and see what you do. And if you keep your price high, I'll keep my price high. But if you lower your price, then I'll retaliate by lowering my price. But as long as you don't lower your price, I'll keep my price high. And we'll both kind of keep our prices high without talking about it, knowing kind of what the other is doing. And over time, they begin to trust each other and just understand that a high price is better for both of them. So what happens to this agreement? Well, surely someone, probably Pam, is going to be tempted by the $100 that could be earned by reneging on the agreement and setting a low price one morning. How should Margaret react? Well, she would probably seek vengeance. So this is a strategy in game theory that we call tit for tat, and the strategy is very simple. Margaret and Pam begin by cooperating today. Every day from this point forward, Margaret will do today whatever Pam did yesterday. If Pam cheated yesterday with a low price, Margaret will retaliate today with a low price. If Pam learns her lesson and sets a high price tomorrow, the following day Margaret will forgive her by also setting a high price. And so they learn each other's behavior and learn to trust each other over time, and that's called tit for tat. And that's how we get to tacit collusion. And this reviews here on this screen what I just talked about. Now, what about a game of avoidance? Okay? Let's say that Richard and Justin don't like each other, and they would be happier being where the other person isn't. Okay? So you look at Justin and Richard and say, well, would they be happier going to a nightclub or going to the movie theater? Well, Richard says, okay, if Justin goes to the nightclub, I would be happier being at the movie theater. I'd get 5 utils instead of 2. And if Justin goes to the movie theater, Richard says, oh, I'd be happier going to the movie theater where I get 4 utils rather than 3 utils. Okay? And Justin looks at it and he says, well, what if Richard goes to the nightclub? Well, if Richard goes to the nightclub, I could get 4 or 6 utils, so I'd rather be in the movie theater. But if Richard goes to the movie theater, then I'd get 8 utils from going to the nightclub and only 1 from the movie theater, so I'd rather be in the nightclub. So we can see that for each of them, they get more happiness by avoiding each other. Now, is there a dominant strategy? No, there isn't a dominant strategy, because Richard doesn't have a dominant strategy of going to the nightclub because you don't have two in the same row, and Justin doesn't have a dominant strategy of going to the movie theater and nightclub either. So you have to look at that and you say, well, neither has 2 circles in the same row or 2 circles in the same column, and because of that, there's no dominant strategy. But there is an interesting pattern here. Notice that there are 2 boxes where there are 2 circles. And here's a strategy for figuring out if there's a Nash equilibrium. If you have 2 circles in the same box, that box is a Nash equilibrium. If you have 2 circles in the same box, that box is a Nash equilibrium. And we have 2 boxes with 2 circles. So in this game, even though there is no dominant strategy for either one, there are 2 Nash equilibrium, because there are 2 boxes with 2 circles. One box with 2 circles is Richard going to the movie theater and Justin going to the nightclub, and the other box with 2 circles is Richard going to the nightclub and Justin going to the movie theater. So there are 2 Nash equilibria, and what that means is that one person will come to an equilibrium and make their decision based on what the other person will do, and they will be content with that. And so that's a strategy for finding a Nash equilibria in these games. So whenever there are 2 circles in the same box, a Nash equilibrium exists. And we saw 2 boxes with 2 circles in them in the previous one, and so there were 2 Nash equilibria. Now, here's another one. Okay, Juice Tree and Juice Max compete against each other, and there are 2 different strategies. Juice Tree is trying to decide, do I charge a higher price or do I charge the same price? And Juice Max is trying to decide, do I advertise or do I keep the same level of advertising? So they're looking at 2 different actions and based on what their opponent does, trying to make more profit. Okay, Juice Max is trying to decide whether to do more advertising or keep it the same. Juice Tree is trying to decide whether to charge a higher price or keep the same price. So Juice Tree looks at this situation and they say, okay, well, what if my competitor does more advertising? Well, if I charge a higher price, I get 2 million. If I charge the same price, I got 3 million. 3 million's better. But what if Juice Max keeps the same advertising? Well, if I charge a higher price, I get 6 million, the same price, 5 million. Well, there's no dominant strategy for Juice Tree, because in this particular case, you don't have 2 circles in the same row for Juice Tree. So there's no dominant strategy there. But what about Juice Max? Juice Max says, well, what if Juice Tree charges a higher price? Well, if Juice Max does more advertising, they get 7 million. Keep same advertising, 6 million. More advertising is better. What if Juice Tree keeps the same price? Well, if I do more advertising, I get 5 million. Same advertising, 4 million. 5 million is better. So in both cases, more advertising is better. And notice for Juice Max, if there are two circles in the same column, then there's a dominant strategy. In this case, there are two circles in the more advertising column. So here, Juice Max has a dominant strategy. Juice Tree does not. Now, we said there's also a Nash equilibrium if there are two circles in the same box. Is that true? Yes. In one of the four boxes, there are two circles. If Juice Tree charges the same price and Juice Max does more advertising, then that is a Nash equilibrium. And so if one competitor does one of those things, then the other competitor will do the other one. And that will be a Nash equilibrium. So whenever there are two circles in a column for a player, a dominant strategy exists. Or if there are two circles in a row for a player, a dominant strategy exists. So we've seen how to determine when a Nash equilibrium exists and when a dominant strategy exists for a player. And that's something you have to be able to know and read, both of those, from a payoff matrix on the AP exam. It's a very common FRQ. Let's look at some differing payoffs here. Let's assume that Allie and Bartow are deciding whether or not to put up a billboard and advertise or not put up a billboard. Well, Allie says, okay, what if Bartow puts up a billboard? Well, I can get 60,000 or 64,000. 64,000 is better, no billboard. What if Bartow puts up no billboard? I can get 85 or 80. 85 is better. Okay, so for Allie, you say, are there two circles in a row? No, there is not. So for Allie, no dominant strategy. What about Bartow? Bartow says, if Allie puts up a billboard, I can get 55 or 50. 55 is better. If no billboard, I can get 70 or 60. 70 is better. So in both cases, putting up a billboard is better for Bartow. So are there two circles in the same column for Bartow? Yes, there are, putting up a billboard. So Bartow has a dominant strategy. Allie does not have a dominant strategy. Are there two circles in one box to determine if there's a Nash equilibrium? Yes. The two circles in the same box are for Bartow putting up a billboard and Allie not putting up a billboard. So if Allie doesn't put up a billboard, then Bartow will. And that will be a that will be a Nash equilibrium. Or if Bartow goes first and puts up a billboard, then Allie will not put up a billboard. And that will be a Nash equilibrium. Now, sometimes on the AP exam, they ask you to change the numbers. So in this particular case, they might say, well, what if advertising costs go down by $4,000? Okay, so if we pay $4,000 less to put up a billboard, then our profit will increase in each of the billboard boxes by $4,000. So in this case, we have to change some of the numbers in the payoff matrix. And this is something they sometimes ask you to do on the AP exam. They show you a payoff matrix and then they change something about it and they ask you to make the changes. Notice you do not change all of the numbers. You only change the numbers that are listed here in green. Why? Because they said advertising costs went down. Well, if you don't put up a billboard, this has no effect on your advertising costs because you weren't paying them to begin with. It only increases your profit if you put up a billboard. So if we look at the first box, both of them are putting up a billboard. So we have to increase those profits by $4,000 each. And we change the numbers from 59 to Bartow and 64 for Allie. In the box on the left-hand side at the bottom, Bartow's putting up a billboard, but Allie is not, so we only change Bartow's number and increase it by 4 to 74. In the box at the top on the right-hand side, only Allie is putting up a billboard, not Bartow, so we only change Allie's number and increase it by 4, 89,000. And in the lower right-hand box, Neither of them are putting up a billboard, so those numbers stay the same. Okay, now we look at the payoff matrix again. And we say, does Allie now have a dominant strategy? Yes, because there are two circles in a row. So Allie's dominant strategy is now to put up a billboard. In the old example, Allie didn't have one. Does Bardo have a dominant strategy? Yes. It continues to be putting up a billboard. Are there Nash equilibria? Well, before there was only one. Bardo putting up a billboard and Allie not putting up a billboard. But now there are two because there's another box with two circles in it, and that's Allie and Bardo both putting up a billboard. So by changing the numbers, we add another Nash equilibria, and Allie gets a dominant strategy. So you have to be able to do that on the AP exam and make sure you're changing the right numbers. Oftentimes you don't change all of them. This is an example of how game theory was used in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Both countries were locked in an arms race and building more nuclear weapons and military equipment and spent huge sums of money on weapons. Now, wouldn't both of them have been better off if they had just come to an agreement to reduce their nuclear weapons and not threaten each other? Yes, but one way to explain the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union was to suppose that both countries were locked in a classic prisoner's dilemma. Because one country would say, look, if I outspend the other country militarily, if the United States says, if I outspend the Soviet Union and they spend less, then I'll be militarily superior. But if I spend more and they spend more, at least we will both be equal to each other. And the Soviet Union said the same thing. And so the dominant strategy for both of them was to outspend each other and spend huge sums of money on their militaries, even though it might have been better for both of them to spend less. And ultimately, what ended the Cold War was this bankrupted the Soviet Union. The United States had many more resources and much more wealth to be able to continue spending on military weapons, but the Soviet Union had less, and it eventually bankrupted the country, and that led to the collapse of communism and the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the end of the Cold War. I think we've already seen this movie, but on The Dark Knight, but I put it in here. This, I think, might be a newer version of it, so if you want to take a look at it again, you can. Here's an AC/DC Econ video on oligopolies and game theory to help you review this again if you need more work with it. Here's an activity on game theory that we'll practice in class. Here's an activity we'll do in class on games of avoidance in game theory and payoff matrices. Here's an AC/DC Econ video by Mr. Clifford on game theory and understanding the dominant strategy, giving you some practice with that. Here's a dominant strategy activity we will do in class. This is an interesting video on game theory on a British game show, and I won't play it right now, but I'll play it for you in class. Here is a question on game theory from the 2008 AP audit exam. See if you can answer this question correctly. Here is an FRQ. I told you free response questions are very common on the AP exam regarding payoff matrices and game theory. Here's a question. It's FRQ number 3 from the 2007 exam. See if you can answer this question. Here is the rubric for that FRQ. See how you did with it. Here is the FRQ from Form B, question number 3 from the 09 AP exam. See if you can answer this question. And here is the rubric for that question. See how well you did with it. And even though this was a rather long module video, and I apologize for that, this is a very important concept and also a complicated and difficult one to understand at first. So I wanted to make sure that I took time with this to go through it and explain it with you because it's very likely that you're going to see this on the AP exam in both multiple choice and maybe a free response section. So here's a summary of what we've learned about game theory and oligopolies in this module. And this concludes our look at Module 65, Game Theory.